Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. Thank you for joining us for this conversation around HBO's The Vow, moderated by the LA Times' Lorraine Ali. Really excited to have this conversation today. But before we begin, I'm going to offer a brief land acknowledgement, as we always do here at the IDA. And today I am coming to you actually from the IDA offices, which is on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to offer thanks to our media sponsor, Variety, for helping to bring this series to all of you today. Thank you. A big thank you to Mara, who is helping us here with ASL interpretation. Thank you very much. And if you want to see some of our upcoming screenings, we only have a few more left at this point, but we've got some good ones. You can go to documentary.org/awards spotlight. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Lorraine to get this conversation started. Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you. Nice to be here. And I am honored to introduce Jehan Nojaim, Director and Executive Producer of The Vow. Oh, you gotta unmute.
You'd think that a filmmaker would figure this stuff out, but great to meet you, and thank you for having me, and I'm excited for this conversation.
I am too, because I have to say I consumed The Vow on HBO episode by episode when it came out, and really, it's obviously not the first documentary or docuseries on a cult, but the way that you go into this, and just some background on a little bit, it's about really the indoctrination of members into the NXIVM cult, and kind of like them trying to leave as well, and you're capturing all this. It almost feels like in real time their journey to leave. So I just wanted to ask you first off, I mean, you've done these award-winning documentaries, Control Room, The Great Hack, The Square. What kind of got you interested in doing something on this?
Yes, many people have seen me do a lot of political work, and all of those films that you mentioned are political films that touch on the zeitgeist of the time, but that are also about unfolding stories and following characters who are going on a journey where the stakes are high. And that's sort of, I started making my first film with Chris Hedges and D.A. Pennebaker, who are incredible filmmakers and mentors of mine, and make verite films. So really the most exciting stories that we've found are films that are unfolding, where you have no idea where they're going to end. So you kind of jump into the ring and talk with the people that you're going to be filming about following this journey along with them. And it's really a gift that the people that you follow give you, in that they're giving you their trust, they're allowing you to sort of be along for the ride. And in exchange, you try not to get in the way as much as possible. You kind of do the anti-directing thing, which is try not to ask too many questions, but to sort of follow as things are happening. And so when this story came on my radar, it was actually a long time ago. It was in 2009. So it was when I had just been awarded the TED Prize, which is a prize given by the TED community, where you have to make a wish for the world, and the TED community comes together to help you make that wish happen. So I had wished for a global day of film where people would be able to see each other and understand each other's perspectives. And I went to Necker Island, Richard Branson's island, because I was invited there to give a talk. And I met Sarah Bronfman there. And she began telling me about NXIVM and about these classes and about the ethics that they were speaking about and how to build a more ethical society and world, and how NXIVM had expanded across the world into places like from the States to Mexico to London to Canada. And I was pretty intrigued, but I never went and took any of the classes. And then a couple of years later, met Mark Vicente, who is one of the characters in the film, in the series. And he told me all about it and said, this was something that I should really check it out. And I met him at the Cannes Film Festival. So all these places were kind of, places where there were successful people doing, interesting work. And so I went to Albany. I took the first 5 days. I was intrigued, but I also thought about this phenomenon in places like Landmark and like what I was seeing at ESP of these groups coming together and having these life-changing weekends and sharing their deepest secrets with each other and being able to open up to strangers for the first time. And I was thinking, is this a new religion, really, where we're searching for community? And what are we not finding in our society today, which is making these kinds of groups so attractive to people? And so I wanted to make a film about it at that time. And it wasn't until 10 years later when I finally finished the class, after making the film about the Egyptian Revolution, meeting my husband, having 3 babies, and then I moved to LA. And Mark said, you should finish this class. And as a good student, I decided to finish it, even though I hadn't ever gotten the access that I wanted when I had tried to approach NXIVM about filming initially. And at that time, there were rumors about this secret society, DOS. There was potentially, this other organization, women's organization, that was happening. And then about a month later, Mark came to me and said, this organization that I have been telling you is going to be world changing in the best possible way. There's a whole underbelly of things happening that I'm shocked by. And he was having a complete crisis of faith. And everything that I knew about him and what he believed in was being completely turned upside down. And, at the beginning, he really wasn't sure what was up, down, right, wrong, who was sort of in on it, who wasn't. And so we just said, why don't we start following you as you go through this process of trying to understand what it is that your last 10 years have been, and try to understand what is happening in the organization. And so we started filming him as we went, and this story just began unfolding, and more people began to leave and question. And back to your original question of why, because I thought this is about two things. What are we searching for in our society that we're missing? Be it living, everybody asks these questions of ourselves, and at least you hope people do. Am I living the life I should be living? Am I doing good? Am I being a good sister, mother? What are my values? Am I living according to my values? And trying to find groups in the same way that religion used to provide us. And the other sort of topic that I found interesting that it touched on is the idea of indoctrination. And you're originally Iraqi, I'm Egyptian, grew up in the Middle East. We have an issue in our part of the world where there is indoctrination into groups that have made a name for themselves doing violent acts. And so, but there's many different kinds of indoctrination, and there's many different, you can be in a terrible relationship for 20 years and wonder how you could have been indoctrinated into staying in that relationship, right? But as somebody from my background, I thought this is fascinating that people who are from Brooklyn and LA and, places where you'd never think that people would sort of join a group and their entire mindset would change, you really can understand, and it's not some, foreign language person speaking over here, you can finally understand how vulnerable we are as human beings, all of us, and how fragile our psyches can be. And not that it's all bad, if you join a group like this, or if you decide to, people could say that many groups have a certain level of indoctrination, right? But it's important, I think, especially as we move in these times where we're all living in our own little bubbles and we're being kind of indoctrinated by our Facebook feeds, that we understand that we are living in our own little bubbles, and that we should kind of look elsewhere and have those conversations with people that think completely differently than we do. So from a sort of 10,000-foot level, that was what was interesting. And I was fascinated with also making something that was internal and a psychological thriller. So what's happening externally is that people who built this organization from the ground up put everything that they had into it. Those very same people we were following as they were dismantling it. And you could see the same person in the archival footage 10 years before have a completely different mindset, in the footage that we were filming. So you could really see their internal struggles over a period of many years. And I found that fascinating, to be making a film that was about, a very real story that was happening on the outside, but the psychological thriller side of it was happening internally with people. And how do I make that visual and cinematic for people to absorb and understand?
Right. And I would assume usually the issue would be if you're doing something like this, that's a story about, a cult or a society, that usually it would be you don't have that access. You can't get that. There's not enough footage, right? Here you have a ton of footage. There's so much. And so, I just want you to talk a little bit about that, because that's also what made this so fascinating. I mean, you just don't get that kind of access otherwise.
Everybody filmed everything. I mean, this was an incredible, we had an incredible story to tell because of the amazing archive that existed. And this was archived from all over the place. So there were people that were filming all of the time, because people felt like they were going through this life-changing experience, and that they should be filming everything that they were going through as they were discovering themselves, or these new concepts. And also filming Keith felt like he was coming up with groundbreaking ideas, and that everything
And just for people that are listening, Keith Raniere is the leader, the founder of this group, and he is now in jail, sex trafficking, racketeering, many other charges.
Yes, so Keith Raniere believed that people should be filming everything, not only all of the classes, but everything that from walks that he would take. Keith Raniere believed that everything should be filmed, not only the classes that he taught, but also everything that went into the classes, and all of the walks that people would take, and so everything was filmed.
Yeah, and it's so, as you're saying, when you're following Mark as kind of a central figure, I think it's his idealism and his sheer and true belief that sucks you in as a viewer, because it is heartbreaking, it's humanizing, but also he represents other people in that these are like really smart, successful people. These are people who, because you tend to think, people that join cults, okay, they're not, I don't know, there's an idea that somehow, well, that could never happen to me because, I'm smart, I'm sophisticated. These were smart, sophisticated people, right? I mean, I think that's one of the big surprises of this too, was watching that and watching how Keith sort of used that, but also used it to build his empire, but also manipulated that.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that people were used to sort of build the empire, to make connections. All of this was through word of mouth. But it also, ultimately, some of the most driven, most successful, most people who really would put everything on the line in order to stand for what they believed in ended up being people who stayed in the longest, and who are still, some of them who are still with him today, and still supportive of him today. So I think that it's a fascinating topic because it really looks at what people, somebody who is able to use psychological manipulation is quite fascinating to watch, because they're able to they're able to work with different people and find that vulnerability in the different people that they're interacting with. And there was a level of sort of, obviously there was a great deal of abuse that happened, but if you're looking at it sort of more clinically, there was also this sort of brilliant manipulation and compartmentalization of information, so that you would watch, there were a number of things that came out in the media, sex cult, Keith Raniere talking about, well, why is a rapist bad? Actually, let's talk about this, right? And it made it seem actually that he was having those conversations with auditoriums of people. I could tell you that I was never a part of a conversation like that. I took the 16-day and it was very much like, what are your values? And what is the, what are your hopes and dreams? And let's look into, but some of these conversations that have now been shared widely online were not conversations that happened unless you had been within the organization and kind of carefully groomed and prepared for that conversation for many years. Mm-hmm. So those conversations generally classes happened with a small number of people in the inner circle. And so when we made our series, we take a while to get, it's not until the 8th episode that you really start to understand some of the misogyny that was being spoken about, some of the more very difficult sort of conversations that led to the abuse that happened, allowed people to potentially decide to get branded or decide to join DOS, right? But it certainly didn't open that way, and when you walked in, so in a way, the public has to understand that 16, 17, or 18,000 people took this curriculum, right? And maybe a small percentage of those people, maybe a few hundred people, kept going with the curriculum and ended up in a class where some of the conversations that came out in court and online and some of the sort of most salacious stuff happened. But the reason why we spent so much time getting there is because the process, it made it seem when these big headlines came out and you automatically assumed that everybody that walked in the door were witnessing some of this, that was some of this kind of very salacious stuff that was happening. But you have to understand, and this is what we hope to do in our film, that this is a very slow process, actually. And you don't actually accept a conversation like that or ideas like that unless you have been really sort of part of this community for a very long time.
And I think that's what the series does do. It, for the viewer, it builds on that same kind of pacing as if you were being sucked in to this indoctrination in a way. I mean, the way it's paced, I think that's what's so brilliant about it, because it pulls you in that way. But I wanted to ask you also, what were some of there must have been a lot of challenges doing this. You're up against this organization who's really litigious, and beyond that, pretty scary, just in terms of how they've gone after members who've defected, who've, turned on them, as they say. What were you up against trying to make this?
When we started, we also weren't trying to prove anything. We were following a story, right? So we were nervous about the fact that we had heard that it was a litigious organization. We were worried that we had heard many stories about, there was some guy that went to jail where child porn was found on his computer, and and he had spoken out against NXIVM, and so there were these stories that had come up where people ended up really shutting up about the whole thing, journalists that had ended up leaving their jobs, and so we were nervous about that. We were never physically worried about ourselves. It wasn't like when we were making The Square and we were standing, in the middle of the square and you had the army coming towards you or whatever. It wasn't like that. It was much more, you never knew whether the sort of the legal machine could be used against you, and I think that's what the characters who we were following and the subjects that we were following were most concerned about. And they obviously were putting themselves on the line. The people that we're following were putting themselves on the line way more than we were. We were following a story. We weren't making anything happen in the story. So we were following Mark and Bonnie and Sarah and Nippy and others as they sort of went on this journey. But it's you hear these stories about what happens with people that talk about Scientology and talk about other groups like this, and it's scary because it can really limit what you're able to do in life and in the future if you get caught up in one of these sort of horrible legal battles. You read about people that have gone bankrupt, that have had all kinds of lies made up about them. And so I think that's what's scary. And in the world that we live in, that's very easy to do when you have sort of Twitter and anybody can write an article and post it and it can be shared any place and it can be complete bullshit. It's like, it's very difficult to have any kind of control over that.
Right.
So I think that was the what made us the most nervous. And I think also two sides of the same coin. You're following people in terms of challenges. You're following people during a time when they are questioning themselves and have lost trust in themselves and lost trust in their ability to make good decisions. And you're asking them at the same time to trust you to follow them and film them in their most vulnerable moments. And they've just gotten out of a situation where their vulnerabilities have been taken advantage of in the worst kinds of ways. And so to ask them to sort of trust you in this time is a big deal. And the people that decided to move forward to do that did it because they felt like them telling their story in the most honest, vulnerable way could potentially help other people. But even that, they've just come from an organization where they've been asked to sacrifice everything for the greater good. And so in a way, by being part of this film, it's this is
Yeah,
happening again, right?
it's
And
mirroring.
so
Yeah,
in that way, I really, we made kind of double and triple and quadruple sure before people participated, and oftentimes we would film for a while before we would even talk about release forms, because we would basically say, let's see how this feels to you. Let's see if you feel comfortable with this. Let's show you footage, so that you just make sure that somebody feels like they're doing something that they feel really good about. And I
right.
have to say that the people that we followed and that, have sort of bared their souls to the world, I just have the greatest admiration for, because it is not easy to do. And I think, and it hasn't been easy, because you're opening yourself up to further criticism online. They've had many, 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 far more letters of appreciation of people that have been in either groups that they've had to get out of, or, as I said, a bad marriage or a terrible work situation. But something that they've heard in the series has sort of, opened them up and made them feel like they're not alone. And I think that that has been very encouraging to everybody that has been a part of the vow, is that they've had those letters. But I would say it was they really jumped, like when you decide to become a subject in any film, it's a real jump off of a cliff. But given the psychological situation that they were going through at the time, and asking somebody to trust when their trust has been completely shattered in the world and themselves and everything that they believed in, I think was probably one of the biggest challenges.
Right. That's a huge amount of responsibility, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
like, yeah. And now, so there is going to be a season 2,
So we were calling it a part 2.
part 2.
It's a part 2. As I said, it's we filmed it the way that we make all of our films, which is an unfolding story. So it continues where part 1 leaves off, but it also looks at, in a Rashomon kind of way, because this is a story about, a big part of the story is about perspective and about why people made the decisions that they did. It's important to look at what was happening in other people's minds as the people that we followed were taking down the organization. And so we will go into this story from a completely different side of the story. We will continue with some of our characters from part 1, and we will understand the legal aspects of the story as we follow the prosecution and the lawyer and the defense lawyers. So you really begin to understand in a much deeper way what consent means, what informed consent means, how this was tried as a RICO case, which is, the same law that is used to pursue the mob. And then I think in part 2, you really come to a much deeper understanding of many of the people that were involved and how this could actually come to take place.
Right. Wow. Wow. Well, this is my last question because we're going to run out of time, but were you surprised at the reaction to the series? I mean, just it became this thing, I think, that had a life of its own. Like, people really started talking about it by like episode 2, episode 3. And as you were talking about it, as it grows and as you get pulled in, you get pulled into the series, and it really kind of had a life of its own. Were you surprised at how many people kind of reacted to it?
We feel so much gratitude for the people that we filmed that opened their lives, for HBO that took such a risk with us in terms of telling a very complicated, nuanced story. I remember I said to HBO, we can't have sex cult in our advertising, because we're not going to do the same thing that everybody else has done, which is to just get eyeballs because, of the word sex and cult, and so just every step of the way, the people that participated in the making of this did it for the right reasons, and took so much care. And I think that what was so gratifying was seeing that the audience, you believe in the intelligence of an audience, that they want to get to something deeper, that they want to understand the psychology that goes into making these very extreme decisions, right? Or, and how could something that seems so crazy like this actually happen? And I think that it's very much a story that parallels what we were dealing with in our society. Look at our political leaders, our recent political leaders, very charismatic leaders that had a very charismatic leader that had very simple answers to very complicated questions. And, and us living in a time when, frankly, you could feel like your grandmother or uncle or sister are living in a cult because they have such completely extremely different views than you do. And look at 50% of our population, right? I think that those ideas and really understanding the psychology behind them, it was much bigger than just a story about NXIVM. It was a story about our humanity and what we're searching for as human beings, and how finding community, finding that kind of friendship and all of that is so incredibly important to us as humans, but also understanding what our vulnerabilities are. And it's not a story of only this group in Albany. It's a story of our society and our world and what we need to be thinking about as we move forward, because our psychology as human beings is at the very root of all of the decisions that we make in our world. And my mother always used to tell me, if George Bush had my mother is a teacher who teaches kids with learning disabilities. And so she tracks everything back to learning disabilities. And she was just like, if George Bush, and you'll appreciate this as an Iraqi, if George Bush had solved his learning disabilities and really had the proper care at an early age, he never would have felt like he had to impress his father in that way where he went and invaded Iraq, and the invasion of Iraq would never have happened. But it was because he constantly had to prove himself to his father. It was because of those learning disabilities that he had to show his father that he could do what his father could never do in Iraq. And in a similar way, I feel like these very deep psychological issues that we need to look at and sort out affect everything that we do in the world. And so I think that people felt that when they saw this. And I think that, it was, these were characters that were incredibly brave in that they opened themselves up and really were vulnerable and authentic and opened themselves up to the world. And I think people felt that. So I was so grateful for the reception, and I hope we have more people on for the ride continuing.
Well, congratulations on making a really compelling docuseries, and thank you for talking to us. And was very excited to talk about the vow, and this was fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me over here in Egypt.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.